Thank you, Robert, for that great introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us here in person and on the live stream. Well, we've already heard a lot about finance throughout today, and there's a very simple reason for that. Money will either make or break the energy transition. And the numbers being thrown around, 2 trillion, 4 trillion, that's an unfathomably large amount of money for, I'm going to guess, most of us in this room. So I want to dive right in. I want to actually open with a lightning round question where I ask the panelists to just say a quick yes or no to get us off on a fast pace. Has it gotten easier or harder to finance the clean energy transition in the last 2 years?
Easier.
Harder.
We love disagreement, healthy disagreement on stage.
Harder.
Jason?
They would know better than I, since I'm not doing that day to day, but I would probably say harder, but maybe I'm wrong.
David, let's start with the optimist. You said easier. Can you talk about how have the last 2 years been for you from where you sit at Blackstone with a lot of cross-cutting factors? We have the Inflation Reduction Act, we just heard from Tom about what a big deal that is. We also have a lot of geopolitical unrest, which we also heard about. So, David, why are you optimistic?
So for us, because we're risk-based, control-oriented equity capital, some of the things that you mentioned and that Tom mentioned, the higher volatility in geopolitics coming out of COVID, also supply chain issues, those things create a lot of volatility in the public capital markets, but for us, having committed private capital is a great opportunity to step in, provide certainty where certainty didn't exist, and to finance some of these really great investment opportunities to accelerate the transition. And that same kind of the geopolitical concerns and otherwise, I think, elevated in people's consciousness that it's not just a single variable equation of reducing CO2 and mission accomplished. It's more complex than that. Energy security certainly came to the fore of people's minds with particularly the war in Ukraine. Affordability and reliability are all part of it, and you have to solve that multivariable equation. And so as we went through a period of, I think, really unprecedented volatility over the last few years, once in a hopefully millennia global health pandemic, not one war but two, unprecedented inflation, rising interest rates, those things caused energy prices, conventional and renewable, to increase. It caused pain on consumers, but what's bringing that back into balance, I think, is continued innovation, technological innovation, especially in the West. Entrepreneurial spirit, which we have in abundance here in America, and then government stepping in with sensible policies, and I do think the IRA was very important. So those things have brought, affordability back into play, and I think stimulated renewed investment.
Karen and Vera, I want to go to you. You both said harder. Can you, from your vantage point at Bridgewater, and you, Vera, focused on lower income countries, can you each talk about why it's become harder to fund the transition over the last couple of years?
Well, I'll say the really obvious thing for us, which is just interest rates are higher, right? And so that's the most extreme force that affects everything, which is when real interest rates, in other words, what you're paying relative to inflation, is negative. Money's basically free. You can fund anything, and you saw lots of junk getting funded. And so it's just a big shift in environment to actually need to get a return on what you're funding and actually having to compete for capital. So that's the biggest deal by far. But the other thing that's happened, and this has to do with some of the things you're implying, of course, is that nothing just gets funded because it gets funded, right? People have to look at the incentives and decide it's a good idea to do something. And when you're talking about funding the clean energy transition, part of it can happen through basically disincentivizing a lot of the fossil fuels and saying, okay, that's going to be very expensive, so go do the green things. And part of it can happen through basically carrots, a little bit of a sticks and carrots thing of saying, we're going to go and really subsidize the things that need to get funded. And I think that thing that's happened over the last 2 years is that consensus has sort of been reached that the sticks approach of making fossil fuels expensive is just intolerable. It's something that we just cannot tolerate. And that basically happened because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think that if you had this conversation 2 years ago, the perfect economist answer is, of course, what you should do is just tax carbon. That's the efficient answer. Then the market finds out what's the most efficient thing to do in order to reduce the carbon. And it was always politically difficult. Europe made a lot of attempts to kind of try to make that work. But that'd be kind of the beautiful answer. And subsidizing a lot sounds like a pretty expensive idea. You run huge deficits, much more difficult. And of course, you're kind of counter-subsidizing because you already have a lot of subsidies of fossil fuels in the system. Russia invades Ukraine, and I think the recognition kind of sets in that, wait a minute, what happens if you start just making fossil fuels less available is that, yeah, you're definitely incentivizing the transition, but you could also really get a slowing economy, and you had such an extreme case of it in Europe that was literally not able to run its economy because it didn't have enough energy. And between that and inflation rising, I think it basically became intolerable to go down this path. So now, the tools at your disposal are basically subsidizing the things you want, and that feels good in the moment because everybody's getting a cheaper price than they otherwise would, but it has more of a natural limit on it than something like taxing carbon that raises funds for the government. Now you're running potentially massive deficits to do it. So in the near term, easier because things like the IRA passed, but our reliance on the next IRA and the next IRA has risen.
That's great, and I want to dive into a lot of that, the carrots versus sticks approach, in a couple minutes. But Vera, I want to turn to you. What's your perspective been on the last 2 years of funding the transition?
I think it's the same thing. The first big issue is the interest rates. And not only as interest rates rise, there's clearly a flight to safety, but also a flight to return. It's much easier now to do an investment in Kansas than it is to convince anybody to go and do the same power investment in India. Because there you're taking FX risk and political risk and all. And here, not only are you investing in a safe haven, but you're also getting an IRA subsidy. And so the IRA subsidy has actually made it a lot more. So now you not only do you have to convince them and show that you can buy down the risk, but you also have to buy up the subsidy from the United States. And so that's made it a lot more difficult for companies to sort of, want to go and invest abroad because you can get even better returns here. I think that's the first thing. Of course, the geopolitical global environment has made it a lot more difficult. Supply chains a lot messier. So even the cost of construction of any renewable energy facility is more difficult. There is the tension between the United States and China, which is also creating, supply chain gaps, and so you can get everything you need if you were to decide as Morocco that you wanted to do electric vehicles, and we're trying to import different things from China and from the United States. That combination has become much more difficult. So, and then in the solar sort of energy space, a lot has already been done. And so I think now we're getting a lot more sort of difficulty trying to do, say, hydrogen in Namibia. How exactly do we do that? Or if you're a believer in the nuclear space, can we do that, and how will that work? So I think it's an issue of, one, exogenous pricing that has gone up because of policies in the advanced world. Second, just the global environment that has become a lot more tense and a lot more difficult. And finally, the lack of technology and knowledge that would be needed to do some of these new things, because the sort of what we know how to do, which is mostly solar panels, the prices of sort of windmills and all haven't collapsed yet to a point where they become quite profitable. I think the only thing is solar as we speak, and so we still need to do battery storage, because if you want to do industry, then you really need to begin to figure out, battery storage and how one can do that, and that is still quite difficult.
That's great, and I want to come back to some of what you said, but Jason, I want to turn to you and tease out what Vera said a couple of minutes ago about how the IRA has actually made it more difficult to fund clean energy in lower income countries, which is probably not what Congress had intended. As somebody who spent time in government but now leads a global energy institute, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question about whether it was what Congress intended. It was intended to boost investment in the United States. So the kind of so-called great sucking sound There are two concerns that one often hears from emerging and developing economies about the IRA, right? One is if you want access to these tax incentives, everything has to be done in the US or in some cases neighboring or free trade countries. And for all the reasons Vera talked about and Tom Donilon talked about, I worry about it is probably good to reassess the assumptions in the Washington Consensus that created the integrated global economy and the WTO of the 1990s. But if we go so far in the direction of thinking for reasons of security and resilience or economic competitiveness, everything has to be done within one's own borders, that's going to be massively difficult for the transition, among many other things. So we got to find that balance. The other is it's just now you have this incredibly generous tax credit, $3 per kilogram for green hydrogen or whatever it is, and people might invest in the United States rather than somewhere else. I will say that after being criticized for years by the Europeans and others for not doing enough on climate, I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for suddenly we're doing too much on climate. So we were spending a huge amount of money to accelerate the pace of decarbonization, and that is a good thing, not a bad thing, but we do need to think very hard, as folks are meeting in Washington this week to think about how we're going to dramatically accelerate the pace of deployment of finance in emerging and developing economies. The IRA was a historic piece of legislation focused on decarbonization for 12% of the world's emissions. That's the United States. And most of the emissions are somewhere else, and the growth in emissions is coming somewhere else. And what we need to do also in Washington is use all the tools of development finance and international economics and export credit and commerce department and all the other parts of the government to really think about how we can play a more meaningful role, frankly, than we have in the past, to dramatically accelerate the pace of capital deployment and clean energy deployment in the parts of the world that really have not contributed a huge amount to emissions to date and don't necessarily have the resources to decarbonize or cope with the impacts of climate change.
Right, and I think when we talk about the US versus the world, obviously it's different when we're talking about China or Europe unhappy with the IRA versus many countries in Africa or Southeast Asia, which understandably and rightfully so, argue that they need some financial help with the transition in a way that China and Europe probably don't need. I want to get back to that in a minute, but I want to come back to what Karen was talking about, carrots versus sticks. A mid-panel lightning round, are lots and lots of carrots enough to address climate change if you have very few sticks? Yes or no?
No.
You need both.
I mean, depends how many carrots, but probably you can come up with enough.
You need both.
So let's talk about that. The IRA is clearly a very large down payment on carrots. But to your point, Karen, you talk about what the Ukraine-Russia war has highlighted, which is the influence and the power of fossil fuels and how stubborn they are and how important they are to our global economy. But of course, their environmental impact is something that needs to be reckoned with. So what kind of sticks could different government bodies and perhaps companies come up with that could be palpable and therefore could help drive change? Maybe Karen, I'll start with you.
Well, I'd say the most obvious one is reverse the subsidies we currently have on fossil fuels. That seems like the most immediate. Why in the world would we be subsidizing fossil fuels today? So there's lots of organizations out there that account for all the fossil fuel subsidies that still exist. I'm sure it's not the most politically popular thing, but just remove those first.
David?
I think I'm kind of more of a carrot person myself, because I think they work better, especially in a market-based economy. Instead of people trying to do everything they can to avoid the stick, they'll do what you want, which is go for the carrot. And in your discussion with Tom, Americans figure that out to the extent that, instead of 400 billion, last estimate was 800, and I agree it's going to be well over $1 trillion. And also, how can you miss that climate's global, and if you're trying to design something that's just in your country without acknowledging all the other countries, it's going to fail. And that's where I think, while well-intentioned, some of the policies in Europe's led on this in a good way in terms of innovation, but some of the sticks, you can end up hitting yourself in the face with it. If you're raising your cost of production and industry, and you're in a world where there's global trade, you're going to reduce your jobs, reduce your tax revenue at the expense of your affordability within your own population. So if you apply that to fossil fuels, it's the consumption of fossil fuels that creates the problem, not the production. People aren't producing more than is being consumed. In the Western democracies, there's been a real focus, because it's easier, I think, to go after the producers with some success in Europe, and they're not really consuming that much less fossil fuels. They're just buying it from places that don't care as much about the environment, transporting it over longer distances, and that's not a great way to do it. So I think, when you think about these sticks, we live in a global economy. The whole basic economics of comparative advantage in trade worked well in a globalized economy, but then with COVID and now with the geopolitical concerns, you have to have energy security. It makes sense to be not rely on just one supply source for something so critical as energy. So I think what the world's going through is you're going to have to endure for a period of time. You're going to forego the natural efficiencies of comparative advantage and free trade to build more domestic supply and security and critical resources, whether it's solar panels or computer chips or otherwise. And so how do we not leave out the global South in all that? And I do think the IRA is going to benefit the global South, because a lot of it is based on accelerating technological innovation and lowering costs. And as we've seen over the last over the last decade, levelized costs of energy for solar has come down dramatically. That's important. It makes it more affordable, especially for poorer countries that don't have, India's average per capita GDP is $2,500. It's not the same as in the US. So I do think that the investments that the IRA will accelerate, that the benefit of that will be shared globally. So I think that's a very important thing. And the US has been a great place to invest for years. Large scale, entrepreneurial, great technology, rule of law, reasonable policies. It could always be better, but I think that's been fantastic. And to the point Jason made, don't criticize us for finally catching up, with the Europeans. And I think it's been a nice way to raise the bar for the world to do the same.
So you said that the IRA could ultimately benefit the global South. Vera, do you agree with that?
I think it will, and I think, just to be clear, nobody's criticizing the United States for the IRA. I think, as Jason said, finally the United States came to the table, and that is, I think, was a very important fact. And I co-chaired the Independent High-Level Expert Group on Climate, and worked very closely with Secretary Kerry, and saw a lot of the work that he did to try to sort of make sure that he could build that bridge between the United States and China, so that as we talk about solar panels, the cheapest solar panels today are Chinese, and a lot of that advancement is happening, but that the United States could take the leadership to bring some of these questions to the table, I think was important. I think, and we're already benefiting. The reason why solar panels are so cheap today is because the Chinese also put a lot of subsidies into producing solar panels, and so the world, yesterday I was talking with Gillian Tett from the FT, and she was saying that in her, a little church in England, they now have solar panels on the roof, and this was a demonstration, and they even have sort of replaceable. Every 1 year the price goes down, and you can replace it. That's where we want to get to, and I think the kind of innovation that will come out of the United States is clearly going to do that. We've done a lot of studies on trade that show that when the developing world trades with the United States, it adds more value, it creates more jobs, and it's much better. And I think that's where we want to get to. Just to link the IRA and the CBAM, the Common Border Adjustment Mechanism, I think that the only way that the IRA then begins to do what we are all talking about is that we don't then have 40-year patents on sharing the technology. Because if all the innovation that comes out of the IRA then needs 40-year patents for the rest of the world to benefit from it, then it will not happen as fast as you're saying. So I think that there has to very quickly have a conversation around how quickly is that sharing of technology going to happen.
You have a few more minutes to put in some questions for our panelists. So please, for those here in the room with us, please be thinking of what you might want to ask our panelists, and we'll get to that in a moment. I want to bring up CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, just a fancy word for a border carbon tax. that is a stick, right? That's a stick poking at somebody else outside of the borders, and all the tariffs on China and other countries, that's also a stick. What kind of, and we can anticipate those tariffs will either stick around or get even more aggressive depending on how elections go later this year. So what, Jason, I might throw this one at you initially, but please everyone chime in. What could be the impact of these on the ability to finance the transition?
We'll see how countries respond. Again, and I think it makes all the sense in the world from the standpoint of basic economics. If you're going to impose a carbon price on your industry, that you want to level the playing field, and it's understandable by Europeans would think that if the energy-intensive industry there has a carbon price to pay, they can't be faced with unfair competition from imports that don't pay that. The question is how others respond to this and whether this creates like a tit-for-tat retaliatory cycle that sort of spirals in this era of economic fragmentation that Tom talked about. And I think that's sort of the concern that I see. I think David's right that investing a lot of money in clean energy will drive down the cost of clean energy, and that will make it more affordable for the rest of the world. But for all the reasons Vera talked about, a higher cost of capital, currency exchange risk, political stability, and regulatory risk, it is really challenging to deploy that capital in the parts of the world that need it the most, even with those lower costs. And this does come back to some of the geopolitical stuff I was talking about with Tom. It is remarkable that last year, nearly twice as much, 1.8 trillion to 1 trillion, clean energy spending to fossil fuel spending. That's a dramatic shift in just a few years. Nearly a third of that spending, more than a third of that spending, was China. We've gone from 1 in 20 vehicles being electric in 2020 to 1 in 5 today. I mean, just staggering growth. Half of those sold in China. So it is in many ways a good thing that China is deploying all of this capital to drive down the cost of clean energy. But what we're seeing in Europe or in the United States is that's a problem. It's not a good thing. And now we need to figure out how to create, Biden just launched a national security investigation into whether Chinese digitally connected electric vehicles are a national security threat. If we see for security reasons, economic competitiveness reasons, that we really have to put in place, you could see where a CBAM goes in the place of not just leveling the playing field. In the U.S., we don't have a carbon price, but we're talking about border adjustments also. That easily flows in the direction of kind of protectionism that makes it harder to have this transition.
Right. It's a bit ironic that the U.S. would be doing that without its own policy.
It depends what the purpose of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is. Yeah.
Well, I think it's going to be messy because well-intended, right, like most policies. And I do think one of the key things it's lacking is a global traded, price of carbon. Because if you had that would give a market signal to emitters, to users. It would be efficient. Market participants could react in a way that individual states trying to micromanage stuff are never going to do quite as well. I think Europe already had a mandatory compliance market on certain industries that raised their cost of energy a lot. This is a way to try to level the playing field a bit and signal their trading partners what a cost of carbon is. But in order to get it through the existing trade agreements, as I understand, it's really only on some of the primary, like raw materials like steel, not on finished goods that have steel in it. So it might hollow out some European industry a bit, which would be a risk. But another way to get at having a global cost of carbon would be if voluntary carbon offsets are really have greater acceptance. SBTI recently approved their use, which is somewhat has been controversial, but I think with more transparency and validation of those offsets, it would also help. Another question you asked about financing energy transition global south. A lot of the kind of most efficient, lowest cost, most productive carbon removal, reforestation, other very legitimate ways to reduce and avoid CO2 are in the global south. And voluntary carbon offsets are a way to transfer money from the West to those developers in a way that, despite John Kerry's best efforts and others over the years, it's just not happening. The West is not going to transfer billions of dollars of taxpayer money to the global south to do that in a mandated stick kind of way. But I think done the right way, voluntary carbon offsets would be a step in the right direction for that.
I would say that In my view, if we didn't have this rising tension with China, we never would have seen this shift to carrots, right? That it's not that everyone in Washington woke up one day and was like, we really got to get serious about climate. I think a lot of that thinking had to do with realizing that we have this strategic adversary, China, and if they're willing to throw, ungodly amounts of money, it's hard to even imagine in our political system this happening, at becoming competitive at these technologies, how could we be, kind of unwilling to do anything down the path of subsidizing these things? And so I think this was much more industrial policy in reaction to China than it was kind of really realizing what we need to do on climate. And that's a great thing that China competition kind of put us in that direction, because you look at the IRA, and now it's gotten other countries to look and say, wait a minute, I don't only want these subsidies in the US, just like you said, I should go do something similar. And it's sort of galvanized that kind of action. The flip side of that is that the existence of that Chinese adversary, the other thing that's kind of in the system, not going away, there's all the inertia there, is everybody is trying to figure out how to redo their supply chains to have less reliance on China. And I think there's very little that could happen that's going to change that train. It's a slow-moving train. Nobody can do it in a day. Companies just can't just write China out of their supply chains. But the thinking on that has just really metastasized, whether it's Washington talking about lots of different items from a national security perspective, or you just look at corporate plans, and it's almost impossible to sit in a corporate boardroom today and say, let's do something new in China, versus let's go double do and do something more expensive to have a resilient supply chain, which really means spend more money and have a double do to make sure I'm not reliant on China. So when you go back to financing the climate transition, again, there's the good and the bad here. The good is it's unleashing a lot of money to compete with China, but the bad is that China is the most competitive on a lot of these things. And when Europe is looking at China flooding them with EVs or solar panels, they're not saying, wow, I'm so glad that I have this really cheap way to do the energy transition. They're saying, our competitiveness is going to be destroyed if we let China subsidize what it's doing and kind of dump the supply on us. So balancing these two things, so we get the best of both worlds, we get some of this really cheap Chinese technology, the benefit of all the subsidies they did, and at the same time use that energy and desire for national competitiveness to fund our own and compete with that and do it locally. There's a best of both worlds and there's a worst of both worlds here.
That's well put. Vera, I want to bring you in. How could some of these sticks, CBAM, tariffs against China, how can some of these policies be implemented in a way that won't further penalize lower income countries that are already dealing with the challenges you've talked about?
I think that's a good question, and Jason mentioned it a little bit. The whole idea around climate change and CO2 emissions is that it's a public good, right? And it's a global commons. And when people sort of are in an environment of global commons, you tax and you sort of have a redistributive method of sharing that. And with the CBAM, it's interesting. I take the case of Egypt, for example. Egypt exports steel, fertilizer, and cement, and other things. Now they've added ceramics to the list, to the EU. And all of these are going to be sort of under the CBAM penalty. And so any one of these imports into the EU is going to. And then the question becomes, well, they're going to make all of this extra resources off of taxing Egypt. Egypt is the space that is being polluted, and the EU gets the resources. And so should we be thinking of some redistributive process? The Indians have come up with an idea, which is to say, let's tax CBAM at origin. So let us, India, do the taxing. And so we can keep the resources. It hasn't yet been fully approved by the EU. But I think that eventually what's going to happen is the US is going to do a CBAM, the EU will do a CBAM, India will do a CBAM, and all of a sudden the rest of the world will come up with stakes, and everybody will have a stake of some sort. And maybe that is, today we are missing a global climate organization, and maybe it's the WTO, but eventually we will start trading CBAM credits, right? Because are you giving me more CBAMs than am I giving you? And that will maybe be one way of beginning to sort of have a global tax. Because, and so this is in some sense today we're maybe complaining about the CBAM, but it may be the best way to do it. It may be the best stick, because everybody puts a stick up, and those who can enforce it the best will then sort of encourage the rest to make sure that they can disclose. I agree with you on the carbon, I wanted to say, but I don't think that I think voluntary should continue. I'd say that very quickly first, that we should keep doing some voluntary for now, But voluntary is such a distortionary process that we need to get to compliance. We need to get to compliance quickly so we can level the DNA across the world, pay the same for the same kind of carbon DNA. And I think that will go much faster also in terms of convincing. So if you had the CBAMs, but you also had a robust, highly integrity-led compliance carbon market, I think we begin to have a conversation that starts working.
That would be the optimal thing, but it's also the nearly impossible thing. So in terms of just taking a situation that's clearly not good right now, there are some things we can do pretty immediately to make it better. It's not going to be perfect next year, but it'll be better. And if we can keep on making it better year after year.
Compliance markets are that difficult to put in place.
Globally, I think difficult. Not in an individual country, but globally.
The emerging economies are desperate for us to get compliance markets quickly. I think that the resistance is coming from the developed world right now because it's going to make it more expensive to do your carbon abatements. And my sense is that with CBAM, we will start having price discovery. And the minute you have price discovery, you can put a compliance system in place.
One of the reasons the IRA worked, I think, and I do agree it was in part due to China, but if you're inherently taxing a country's choosing, a democratic country, so voters, right? And they're generally the people paying the taxes, and they're also the ones that vote. It's more acceptable, I think, to voters to be taxed to pay a subsidy if that subsidy is benefiting workers in that same economy, less easy to sell if it's a transfer payment to people who aren't citizens of that country. I just think that's inherently a bit more challenging.
A compliance price is not a transfer. A compliance cost of carbon is one of two things. It's either the fossil fuel industry paying to abate while it finds new technology. So it's a cost. It's not a subsidy. It's just a tax, right?
It's just
You're
another way to
correct.
do a carbon tax.
It's a tax.
Sounds like
on the
next year,
citizens of that
Jason, we
country.
need a panel on carbon offsets.
Yeah, with David and Vera, this is going to be great.
Yeah. I love that dialogue. I do want to get to a couple of questions from the audience. We have one for you, David, which is, what do you think are the least and most efficient subsidy allocations in the IRA, which kind of jumps off what you were just saying?
I think the things that were among the most efficient were actually some of the existing subsidies, the investment tax credit, the production tax credit, but those had been done, like for a couple of years. You have to wonder, would Congress renew? No one knew because you can't call elections, and you weren't really getting the real benefit of it. And what the IRA did was take that out for a full decade, and a decade's long enough that you can make investment decisions behind it. And what it did was it lowered the inherent risk premium in the cost of capital for those industries, for solar, for wind. It also applied that subsidy to grid-scale battery storage, which it had not been eligible for before, which is very important because wind and solar don't produce power necessarily when and where it's needed. You need to be able to store it. So I thought that one of the more effective things in the IRA was just extending the duration of that subsidy over a period which someone could invest behind, and not having it always be wondering, is it going to get renewed or not? And frankly, the incentives for domestic manufacturing, I think, make it more resilient. There are elections, it's hard to call, but legislation tends to be more resilient. And when all kinds of states, red, blue, purple, all have more jobs associated with these industries, I think it makes it a lot more resilient. Some of the things that were less efficient but very intentional are the things that weren't going to get private funding because they don't work with us. Like hydrogen needs a big subsidy. The competing fuels, natural gas, there's lots of folks willing to do it the old-fashioned way and drill for it for $3 an MMBTU. You'd get more than you want of it. And the subsidy for hydrogen is $3 a kilogram. If you convert that to MMBTUs, it's $21. It's 7 times, and it's still maybe not economic. So I think to jumpstart certain technologies, that is a role for government to provide a subsidy. Now let's see if hydrogen, like solar, got down a cost curve. Debatable whether hydrogen will actually be able to enjoy those same kinds of productivity improvements. But things like that, they're not efficient, but it's conscious trying to stimulate that. Or subsidies for nuclear fusion or small modular reactors, things that would be great. They do make sense. The time horizon's a little long for private capital, and there's a lot of technology risk. So I think the things that we're trying to spur really breakthrough type technologies, not efficient, but that's why the government, I think, needed to do it, because the private sector really wasn't doing it.
I want to go to a question for you, Vera. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about the pace of reform in multilateral development banks?
We just put out a report 2 days ago on that. Singh and Larry Summers, NK Singh under the India G20, and Larry Summers were chairing a committee for which I was a part, where we had 28 pieces of reform that were proposed to the multilateral development banks. One of them, of course, was to do more on climate, but more importantly was to see whether they could use their credit for this audience, their credit enhancement tools more efficiently and more effectively. And so, for example, one of the ideas was, the World Bank used to have sort of guarantee facilities, but they had 20 guarantee facilities inside the World Bank group. And so, first of all, you had to figure out which one you had to go and knock the door to get. But secondly, amongst the MDBs, they were not sharing some of their credit enhancement facilities. And since each one of them had a different annual cycle, if you were doing a project, say, in Colombia or Cote d'Ivoire or Cameroon, and that particular MDB had run out of its guarantee facility timeline, you had to wait for the next fiscal year. And that was another 6 months. The World Bank has now brought all of its guarantee tools under one roof. And the next big step is to see whether we can sort of have everybody share the guarantee tools together. The report says that the glass is half full and that there's a lot more that can be done. But I think what is good about it is that there's 28 things that we know need to be done. The president of the World Bank has put together a team. I think people from the private sector are members of that, and hopefully we can do more.
In our final moments together, I want to do a concluding lightning round. The first will be word association to sum up some of what we chatted about. I encourage our panelists to be as brief as possible. So what's the first word that pops into your mind when I say carbon tax? Don't rush to start first.
An economist's dream.
That's good.
Good policy.
Inevitable.
Increase in domestic resources.
Carbon offsets.
Good.
Confusing for most players.
Important middle step.
Heterogeneity and quality.
China. That always
Pass.
gets muffled laughter from the audience. Wait, what did you say, David?
Pass.
That is technically a word.
The elephant in the room in every conversation.
You just want one word? Is that what you're saying?
A couple words.
Competition.
Competition.
Okay, we got to repeat. That was a good one, Jason. Final question. This is a agree or disagree. So Fatih Birol, the executive director of the IEA, he's been mentioned a couple times today already. He wrote the following sentence at the very end of an op-ed he wrote in the Financial Times in March. And this is regarding all of the elections around the world, including, of course, here in the United States. Quote, while changes in governments may well affect the pace of energy transitions, accelerating them in some cases, slowing them in others, they won't alter the fundamental direction of travel, end quote. Do you agree or disagree?
Sure, the direction of travel, but the slope of that line matters a lot, and I wouldn't have devoted a big part of my career to starting an institute with the word policy in it if I didn't believe policy mattered. This doesn't just happen, this energy transition by itself.
Agree.
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 And Jason does also agree, but he is right that the pace matters. And on that relatively optimistic tone, I want to thank our panelists for this conversation.